I knew something was off the moment Vanessa came home smelling like his cologne. David's cologne, my boss's cologne. It hit me like a slap in the face. I stood in the kitchen, frozen, holding a plate I'd been rinsing for who knows how long. It wasn't even subtle. She came in, kissed me on the cheek like everything was normal, but that smell, it clung to her, sharp and familiar. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe she brushed up against someone at the grocery store? But as she moved past me, heading straight for the shower without saying a word, that gnawing doubt dug in deeper. The same brand of cologne David wears every damn day in the office. I should have said something right then, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, plate still in my hand, feeling my stomach churn. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed things weren't right between us. The late-night text messages, the sudden need for me time, the way she seemed to light up when talking about someone at work, but I pushed it aside. It's easier that way, isn't it? You tell yourself it's nothing, because facing the truth is so much harder. But this was too blatant to ignore. Something inside me clicked. I wasn't just some paranoid husband anymore. I needed to know who she was spending time with and why. But deep down, I already knew. I just didn't want to admit it yet. The cologne incident ate at me for days. Vanessa acted normal, like nothing had changed. Maybe that was the worst part, the ease with which she continued her daily routine, as if she hadn't just thrown a grenade into our marriage. I wanted to believe I was overthinking it, that I was paranoid. But something told me I wasn't wrong. That smell was too specific, too familiar. I wasn't imagining it. So, I did what any sane person wouldn't want to admit doing. I started digging. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know. I couldn't just let it slide, not this time. I started small, checking her phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through her messages while she was in the shower or out with friends. At first, there wasn't anything obvious, just the usual stuff, chats with her girlfriends, messages from her mom. But then I noticed a contact name that I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was listed as D. And there was something off about the way their conversations went. It wasn't outright flirty or anything, but there was a certain familiarity, a tone that didn't sit right with me. Most of the messages were short, like, "See you soon," or "I'll meet you there," but there was no mention of work in those texts. No context that matched her part-time job or anything related to the kids. And that was when my gut feeling turned into something more concrete. I'd been suspecting for a while, but now I had something to focus on. The next time Vanessa left the house, saying she had to run some errands, I decided to test my theory. I told her I had a meeting that afternoon, but instead, I stayed home and logged into the car's GPS system. I know, it sounds extreme, but this wasn't some casual suspicion anymore. I needed answers. The system showed her heading to a location about 30 minutes away, nowhere near the grocery store or anywhere else she'd normally go. It was the industrial district, not exactly a place for casual errands. I got in my car and followed the route, heart pounding in my chest like I was about to confront a criminal. I kept telling myself that maybe she was meeting a friend, maybe I was being ridiculous. But every mile that took me closer to that address, my instincts screamed louder that I was on the right track. When I finally arrived, it all clicked. She'd parked at a small, nondescript building, one of those places that could either be a startup office or some shady warehouse. And there, parked right beside her car, was David's sleek, black BMW. I recognized it immediately. He was the kind of guy who made sure everyone in the office knew he drove the most expensive car in the lot. A status symbol. I pulled up a block away, just close enough to watch but far enough to not draw attention. I didn't know what I was hoping to see, maybe them coming out, laughing like it was all some big joke. But I didn't have to wait long. They emerged about 15 minutes later. She was wearing that same smile she used to give me when we first started dating, and he was grinning like he owned the world. The bastard had his arm around her waist, pulling her close like it was the most natural thing in the world. They weren't even trying to hide it. In that moment, my mind went blank. There wasn't room for anger yet, just this cold, empty realization that everything I had been suspecting was real. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. They were right there, walking to their cars like it was another day in their double life. I watched them, numb, as they said their goodbyes, Vanessa getting into her car like she hadn't just shattered the life we'd built together. She drove off, and David lingered for a moment, probably texting her some last-minute line before heading back to his office. I couldn't believe how casual it all was. They didn't even check if anyone was watching. They didn't care. That's what stung the most. They were so comfortable, so sure they wouldn't get caught. I sat in my car for a long time after they left, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm into David's office, kick down the door, and confront him right there. But what would that solve? I needed more than just my own eyes on them. I needed proof, something concrete that couldn't be denied. So, I decided to follow Vanessa, see where she'd go next. Maybe I'd catch them meeting up again, maybe this wasn't a one-time thing. But as I started the car and pulled onto the road, I realized I didn't need to follow her this time. I already knew enough. I went home, and that's when it really hit me. I sat in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so wrong. We used to be happy, or at least I thought we were. Sure, things had changed after the kids came along and our schedules got crazier, but that happens to every couple, right? You figure it out. You don't run into the arms of someone else. I felt like an idiot. All those late-night work calls, the business trips, the sudden interest in taking care of her appearance, it was all right there in front of me, and I'd ignored it. I had trusted her. I had trusted both of them. I kept playing back every interaction with David, wondering how long he'd been screwing me over. He wasn't just my boss, he was someone I looked up to, someone I'd invited into my life, into my home on more than one occasion. We'd had barbecues together. He'd complimented my wife, my kids. All the while, he was taking what wasn't his. That night, when Vanessa got home, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Not yet. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, acted like everything was fine. And I played along. It took everything in me to not confront her right then and there, but I needed time. Time to think, time to plan. The cold rage building up inside me wasn't ready to be unleashed, not yet. But the next step was clear. I had to know how deep this went. How long had she been lying to me? Was it just David, or had there been others? The betrayal I felt was like a slow poison, seeping into every thought, every memory I had of us. I couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. So, the next morning, while she was out, I went through her things again. This time, I wasn't just looking at her messages. I was searching for anything, receipts, notes, anything that would give me more of the story. And that's when I found it, a burner phone, tucked away in the back of her closet, behind some old shoes she hadn't worn in years. My hand shook as I unlocked it. There, in plain view, was the confirmation I needed. Texts, photos, all from David. Messages that weren't meant for a coworker or a friend. They were for a lover. The anger that had been simmering finally boiled over. I had the proof now, everything I needed to confront her. But as much as I wanted to storm into her face and demand answers, I knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. This wasn't just about her. This was about David too, and I wasn't going to let either of them walk away unscathed. I closed the phone, placed it back where I found it, and sat down at the kitchen table. My thoughts raced. Vanessa would be home soon, and I needed to figure out what my next move was going to be. When Vanessa got home that evening, I was ready. I'd spent the whole day replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out how to approach it. There's no manual for this, no step-by-step guide for confronting your wife when you find out she's been screwing your boss. The rage I felt earlier was still there, bubbling just under the surface, but I knew I had to control it. If I let it explode too soon, I'd lose my chance to get the truth. So, I waited. Patiently. She walked in like she always did, tossing her keys on the counter, slipping off her shoes, and giving me the usual half-hearted smile. It was almost impressive how casual she was, like she wasn't living a double life. I watched her closely, taking in every little detail, how she avoided eye contact, how she headed straight for the shower again, probably to wash away whatever traces of him she thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't follow her. I just sat there, waiting for her to come out, my mind racing. Every fiber of my being wanted to shout, scream, break something. But I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, hair still damp, wrapped in a towel like it was just another normal evening, I made my move. Vanessa, we need to talk. She froze for a split second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. She turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral. What's up? She asked, but I could hear the slight tremor in her voice. She knew something was coming. I know about David. I said it plainly, without any emotion, just letting the words hang in the air between us. There was no point in easing into it. I needed to see her reaction, raw and unfiltered. Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to come up with some excuse, some way to wriggle out of it. But she must have realized there was no way to talk her way out of this one. Not with the way I was looking at her. What are you talking about? She tried anyway, her voice shaky, but there was no conviction behind it. I'm talking about you and my boss, I said, standing up from the table, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I followed you, Vanessa. I know you've been meeting him. I know about the texts. The burner phone. I know everything. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She took a step back, wrapping the towel tighter around herself like it could shield her from what was coming. Tom, I can explain. Explain? I cut her off, my voice rising. I could feel the anger spilling over now, no matter how hard I tried to keep it in check. What the hell is there to explain? You've been lying to me. You've been screwing him behind my back, and you expect me to just sit here and listen to whatever bullshit you're about to spew? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. She'd used those tears too many times before, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me with them now. It wasn't, she started, but I wasn't letting her finish. Don't you dare say it wasn't what it looks like, I snarled, taking a step toward her. I saw you with him, Vanessa. I saw you laughing with him, touching him. You didn't even try to hide it. How long has this been going on? She didn't answer right away, just stood there, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for an escape. Finally, she whispered, a few months. A few months? I repeated, my voice incredulous. You've been screwing my boss for months, and you thought I wouldn't find out? It's not like that, she said, her voice shaking now, her hands trembling as she clutched the towel tighter. I didn't mean for it to happen. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Didn't mean for it to happen? You expect me to believe that? You don't just fall into bed with someone by accident, Vanessa. She flinched at that, but I wasn't done. How could you do this? After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for this family, how could you betray me like this? I was lonely, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're never here anymore, Tom. You're always working late, always tired. We don't talk like we used to. I didn't feel like you cared anymore. That's your excuse? I asked, my voice cold. You were lonely? So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me how you felt, you decided to screw my boss? That's how you fix our marriage? I didn't plan it, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks now. It just happened. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear. I didn't know how to stop. I stared at her, barely able to comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. She didn't know how to stop? Like she was some kind of helpless victim in all this? My blood boiled, and I took a step closer to her, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles were white. You didn't know how to stop? I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. You didn't want to hurt me? Do you even hear yourself? You didn't think about me at all, Vanessa. You didn't care about me or the kids or anything except getting what you wanted. Her sobs were louder now, her whole body shaking, but I wasn't done. How long have you been seeing him, huh? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back? She didn't answer right away, just stood there, crying, her shoulders shaking. I could feel my patience slipping away, my control hanging by a thread. "Answer me!" I shouted, and she flinched again. "A few months," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. We started talking after that company dinner. You remember? You were so busy, so caught up in work, and I don't know. One thing led to another. I laughed again, that bitter, hollow sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. One thing led to another, I repeated, shaking my head. That's your excuse? That's what you're going with? She sobbed harder, trying to speak through her tears, but I wasn't hearing it anymore. You disgust me, I said, my voice cold and flat. I can't even look at you right now. Tom, please, she begged, taking a step toward me. I'm sorry. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can work through this. I stepped back, putting distance between us. Work through this? There's no working through this, Vanessa. You crossed a line. You didn't just cheat on me, you cheated on us. You betrayed everything we built together. I love you, she cried, her voice desperate. I never stopped loving you. Don't say that, I snapped, my anger flaring again. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have slept with him. You wouldn't have lied to my face for months. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands, and for a moment, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But then I remembered what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and any trace of pity vanished. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice hard and final. There's no coming back from this. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with panic. No, Tom, please. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I'm not the one who threw it away, I said, my voice cold. You did that the moment you decided to sleep with David. She cried harder, but I didn't care anymore. I'd made up my mind. There was no going back. I turned and walked out of the room, her sobs echoing behind me, but I didn't stop. I went upstairs, packed a bag, and walked out of the house without looking back. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let either of them get away with this. They'd both made their choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. When I walked out of the house that night, everything in me wanted to just disappear, to leave behind the mess Vanessa had created. But I knew I couldn't do that, not yet. I wasn't just going to walk away and let her off the hook like nothing had happened. She had destroyed our marriage, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it without feeling the weight of what she'd done. I drove around aimlessly for a while, trying to calm down. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I couldn't stay in that house, but I wasn't going to make it easy for her either. She'd spent months playing me for a fool, and now it was time to turn the tables. It wasn't just about me, it was about our kids, our life. She'd torn it all apart, and she was going to pay for it. I pulled into a parking lot and sat there in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. My mind was clear now, focused. Vanessa wasn't going to see this coming. I wasn't just going to pack my bags and move on, I was going to make sure she felt every bit of the betrayal she'd inflicted on me. The first step was simple. I called our bank. We had a joint account, something we'd set up years ago when we first got married, back when trust wasn't an issue. I transferred every last penny out of it and into my own personal account. I didn't care if it was petty, it was the least she deserved. She wasn't going to have the luxury of using that money for whatever plans she had with David. If she wanted to run off with him, she'd have to do it without a single cent of mine. After that, I called a lawyer. It was late, but I knew someone would pick up. I'd heard good things about a guy named Harris, a ruthless divorce attorney with a reputation for getting the upper hand in situations like this. Within 10 minutes, I had him on the phone. What's the situation? He asked, his voice brisk and businesslike. My wife has been cheating on me for months, I said, the words sounding even uglier now that I was saying them out loud. I've got proof, texts, pictures. I want out, but I'm not leaving her with anything. Harris didn't miss a beat. We can work with that. The first thing you need to do is make sure she doesn't have access to any of your financials. Lock down anything that's in your name. Change passwords, freeze accounts, everything. I already moved the money out of the joint account, I said. Good. Now, do you have access to the house? For now, I said, my grip on the phone tightening. I'm not staying there, but it's still mine. Perfect, Harris said. We're going to hit her where it hurts. I'll file for divorce first thing in the morning, and we'll make sure you come out on top. If she's been unfaithful, especially with your boss, we can use that to your advantage. Custody, assets, everything, she's not walking away with anything more than she deserves. His words were exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her dictate how things ended. I was going to take control, and she was going to feel every ounce of it. I thanked Harris and hung up, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The gears were already in motion. Now, I just needed to figure out the next step in making her life as miserable as she'd made mine. I drove back to the house, but instead of going inside, I stayed in the car and watched from the driveway. The lights were still on, and I could see Vanessa moving around through the windows. Part of me wanted to storm in and tell her what I'd done, to see the look on her face when she realized she was losing everything. But I knew it wasn't time yet. Let her sit there, thinking everything was fine for just a little while longer. Instead, I took out my phone and scrolled through her social media accounts. Vanessa was active on all of them: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. She loved to post pictures of our family, of our vacations, of her perfect life. It was all bullshit, of course, but to the outside world, we were the picture of happiness. I'd always hated how she curated our life like it was some kind of show for everyone to watch, but now I realized it could work in my favor. I logged into her Facebook account. I knew her passwords. She wasn't exactly cautious about those kinds of things. Once I was in, I went straight to her profile settings and changed her relationship status from married to it's complicated. Then, I scrolled through her friends list, looking for David. He was there, of course, listed as one of her closest friends. I clicked on his profile and sent him a friend request. It was petty, sure, but I wanted him to see that I knew. I wanted him to know that his little secret wasn't a secret anymore. Then, I did something I knew would hit her where it hurt. I went to her latest post, a picture of us and the kids from a few months ago, smiling at some family event, and I added a comment: amazing how everything looks perfect in a photo, but behind the scenes, it's all a lie. Hope your new relationship is worth it, Vanessa. It was a public comment. Everyone who followed her would see it. Her friends, her family. I knew she'd freak out the moment she saw it, but that was the point. She was going to feel the same embarrassment and humiliation that she'd made me feel. I wasn't going to let her hide behind her fake life anymore. I sat there in the car for a while longer, waiting for some kind of response. It didn't take long. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. It was a text from Vanessa. "What the hell are you doing?" I didn't respond. Let her stew in it. Let her panic. A few minutes later, another text came through. "Tom, please. Take it down. Let's talk." Talk? Now she wanted to talk? After months of lying and sneaking around, now she wanted to have a conversation? I turned off my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. She could wait. She'd waited this long to come clean, and now it was my turn to make her sweat. I drove to a hotel and checked in for the night. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing where I was or what I was doing. Let her wonder. Let her sit there in the empty house, panicking about what was going to happen next. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling more clear-headed than I had in weeks. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I still had to deal with David, and that was going to be a whole different beast. But for now, I was focused on Vanessa. I called Harris again to check on the progress of the divorce. He assured me everything was moving forward and that we'd have the papers ready for her to sign soon. In the meantime, I started going through our finances, making sure everything that could be protected was. The house was in both our names, but I wasn't worried about that yet. She wouldn't be able to afford it on her own without my income, and I was ready to make sure she didn't get a single cent more than she deserved. By midday, I decided it was time to face her. I couldn't avoid it forever, and part of me was looking forward to seeing the look on her face when I laid everything out. I drove back to the house, my stomach tightening as I pulled into the driveway. Her car was there, but everything seemed quiet. I walked up to the front door and let myself in. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I walked in, her expression a mix of fear and anger. "You can't just do this," she said, her voice shaky. "You can't just take the money and post things like that online. We need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I said, crossing my arms as I leaned against the counter. "You weren't too interested in talking when you were sneaking around with David." Her eyes flickered with guilt, and she looked down at the table. "I know I messed up. But please, don't do this. We can fix it. We can go to counseling." "Counseling?" I interrupted, my voice hard. "You think we can fix this? After what you did?" She didn't respond, just sat there, staring at her hands. I took a step closer, my voice dropping. "There's no fixing this, Vanessa. I'm filing for divorce. You're going to get what you deserve, and I'm making sure you don't walk away with anything more than that." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she started to cry. "I don't want this, Tom. I don't want to lose you. I made a mistake, but I still love you." "Love?" I scoffed. "You don't know what love is. You threw it all away for some fling with my boss. So don't sit there and tell me you love me." She sobbed harder, but I wasn't moved. I'd given her my heart, my trust, and she'd torn it apart. Now, she was going to face the consequences. "I'm staying at a hotel," I said, turning to leave. "You'll hear from my lawyer soon." I walked out of the house without looking back, the sound of her crying fading behind me. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. Just a cold, hollow feeling that this was only the beginning. Vanessa thought she could play me for a fool, but she was about to learn how wrong she was. If getting back at Vanessa felt like taking out the trash, going after David was going to be a different kind of satisfaction. He wasn't just a guy who slept with my wife, he was my boss. That made it personal on another level. The smug bastard had the nerve to smile in my face at work while screwing my wife behind my back. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this clean, not a chance. He thought he had power over me because he signed my paychecks, but he was about to find out how wrong he was. I spent the night in the hotel plotting out every move. Harris, my lawyer, had already given me some advice on how to handle the divorce, but dealing with David required a different strategy. The corporate world had its own rules, and I knew that playing by them wasn't going to be enough. I needed to hit him where it hurt most, his reputation and his wallet. The next day, I went into work like nothing had changed. I wasn't about to give David the satisfaction of knowing I was onto him just yet. He was probably expecting me to show up angry, maybe even begging for an explanation, but I wasn't going to give him that. I walked into the office, smiled at the receptionist, and sat down at my desk like it was any other day. Inside, though, I was ready to explode. David's office was just a few doors down from mine, his nameplate gleaming on the wall. For a few moments, I just sat there, staring at it, thinking about how much I wanted to march in there and wipe that smug grin off his face. But that would have been too easy. No, I wanted him to suffer, to lose everything the way I had. He wasn't going to get a free pass just because he had a higher title. First things first, I needed to gather ammunition. It wasn't enough to just blow up at him in private. I needed to take this public, to make sure everyone knew who David really was. Over the years, I'd learned plenty of things about him, things I hadn't cared about at the time, but now they were valuable. David liked to party. He'd thrown a few company-sponsored events that had gotten a little too wild, with booze flowing and company credit cards picking up the tab. If I could connect the dots between his personal missteps and company money, I could do some real damage. I started digging through my emails, searching for any receipts or paperwork that might hint at his misuse of company funds. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were multiple instances where he'd expensed nights out at bars or fancy dinners that had nothing to do with work. I saved copies of everything, carefully documenting each instance. It wasn't just about getting him fired, it was about ensuring that when he went down, he wouldn't have a safety net to fall back on. I also knew that David had a habit of flirting with women in the office. Before Vanessa, I hadn't paid much attention to it. He'd always been a little too smooth for his own good, and some of the younger women seemed to eat it up. But now, I realized that his behavior could be a goldmine for me. If I could find someone else he'd crossed the line with, I could leverage that too. Sexual harassment was no joke in the corporate world, and I was willing to bet that David had left a trail of uncomfortable situations in his wake. There was one woman in particular who came to mind, Kara. She was a new hire, fresh out of college, and David had been all over her during office functions. I remembered seeing him getting a little too close to her at one of our holiday parties, and she hadn't looked comfortable. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now I wondered if there was more to the story. During lunch, I casually approached Kara in the break room. She was sitting alone, scrolling through her phone, and I sat down across from her. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Kara," I said, keeping my tone light. "How's the job going so far?" She shrugged, clearly not in the mood for small talk. "It's fine, I guess. Kind of overwhelming sometimes, but it's a good opportunity." "I get that," I said, nodding. "It can be a lot, especially with how fast-paced things are here. By the way, I noticed something at the holiday party a while back. David was talking to you for a long time. I hope he wasn't making you uncomfortable." Her expression tightened for a moment, but she quickly covered it with a smile. "No, it was fine. Just, office small talk." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but if David's crossed any lines with you, you don't have to stay quiet about it. You're not the only one he's done this to." Kara's eyes widened slightly, and she hesitated before responding. "Has he done something like this before?" "Let's just say David has a history," I said carefully. "I don't want to push you, but if there's something you want to talk about, you can trust me." She looked around the break room, making sure no one else was listening, then leaned in. "He's been weird with me since I started. At first, I thought it was just him being friendly, but then he started making comments about how I looked in my dress at the party. And once, when we were in a meeting, he brushed against me in a way that didn't feel accidental. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cause drama, but it's been bothering me." I felt a surge of anger, but I kept it under control. This was exactly what I needed. "You shouldn't have to deal with that," I said, my voice calm. There are ways to report this kind of behavior. You don't have to do it alone." Kara looked nervous, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. "I don't want to lose my job," she said quietly. "You won't," I assured her. "In fact, if you speak up, you'll be protected. David's the one who should be worried about his job, not you." She nodded slowly, still unsure but clearly considering her options. I knew I couldn't push her too hard right now, but I'd planted the seed. If she decided to come forward, it would be another nail in David's coffin. After our conversation, I went back to my desk and started compiling everything I had on him. The expense reports, the inappropriate behavior with Kara, it was all starting to come together. But I wasn't just going to report him through normal channels. That would be too slow, too clean. I wanted this to blow up in his face, to make sure everyone knew what kind of man he really was. I reached out to a reporter I knew from a local business magazine. We'd crossed paths a few times at networking events, and I knew he'd be interested in a story like this, especially if it involved a high-profile executive like David. I didn't give him everything right away, just enough to pique his interest. A little tip about some potential financial mismanagement and a hint that there might be more to the story if he dug deeper. He bit immediately, promising to look into it and get back to me. That was the beauty of it. Once the media got involved, it wouldn't just be a quiet dismissal. It would be a public spectacle, and David's career would be over. The next step was confronting him directly. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for the fallout. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized he was screwed. The opportunity came a few days later, during a staff meeting. David was his usual smug self, standing at the front of the room, talking about some new client we'd landed. He made eye contact with me a few times, probably thinking everything was still normal. But when the meeting ended, I stood up and made my way to his office. "Tom, what's up?" he asked, giving me that same fake smile he always wore. "Everything okay?" I shut the door behind me and crossed my arms, staring him down. "You tell me, David." He raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding where this was going. "Is there a problem?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice so no one else could hear. "I know about you and Vanessa." His face froze, the color draining from his cheeks. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me like a deer caught in the headlights. What are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to recover. "Don't play dumb," I said, my voice cold. "I know everything. I've seen the texts, the pictures. You've been screwing my wife for months." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door like he was calculating an escape route. "Tom, listen." "No," I cut him off, stepping even closer. "You listen. You thought you could get away with this because you're my boss. You thought I wouldn't find out. But here's the thing, David, I'm not just going to walk away. I'm going to destroy you." "Come on, man, it's not what you think," he said, his voice trembling. "It was just a mistake. It didn't mean anything." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A mistake? You call months of screwing my wife a mistake? You're pathetic." He started to say something else, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Here's what's going to happen. I've got everything on you, the expenses, the harassment, the affair. It's all documented, and I'm making sure the right people see it. You're done, David." His eyes widened in panic. "Wait, Tom, we can work this out." "Work this out?" I repeated, shaking my head. "There's no working this out. You're finished." Without another word, I turned and walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, pale and shaking. He thought he could get away with it, but he was about to learn that actions have consequences. David wasn't just going to lose his job, he was going to lose everything. After leaving David's office, I felt an unexpected calm. The confrontation hadn't gone the way he probably imagined it would. I hadn't lost my temper or thrown a punch, I hadn't needed to. Watching him squirm, watching the fear creep into his eyes as he realized his career was over, that was enough. But as satisfying as that moment was, I knew I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing to handle before I could close this chapter: Vanessa. I hadn't spoken to her since that night I walked out of the house. She'd tried to call and text several times, but I ignored all of it. I needed space, and I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. I wasn't interested in hearing how sorry she was or how she hadn't meant to hurt me. The truth was already clear, and there was nothing she could say that would change it. But now that the wheels were in motion with the divorce, and with David's downfall all but guaranteed, it was time to deal with her. We couldn't avoid each other forever. We still had to figure out what to do about the house, the kids, and everything else that came with the mess she created. Part of me dreaded the conversation because I knew it was going to be ugly, but it was time to face it head on. I called her that afternoon. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the tension in her voice immediately. "Tom," she asked, sounding unsure, like she couldn't believe I'd finally reached out. "Are you okay?" "I've been trying to." "We need to talk," I interrupted, keeping my voice cold and detached. I wasn't here to exchange pleasantries or listen to her talk about how worried she was. "Tonight. At the house." There was a pause, then a hesitant, "Okay." I didn't wait for her to say more before I hung up. There was nothing left to discuss on the phone. The conversation needed to happen in person, and I wanted it over with. I showed up at the house just after sunset. It felt strange to be walking up to my own front door like I was visiting a stranger. In a way, I was. This wasn't my home anymore. The place I'd once felt comfortable in was now just a shell of what it had been, tainted by the lies and betrayal that Vanessa had brought into it. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side of that door, but I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around the truth. Vanessa opened the door before I even had a chance to knock. She must have been watching from the window, waiting for me. Her face was pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. There was none of the confident, put-together woman I'd once known. Now, she just looked broken. "Tom," she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm so glad you're here. We need to talk." "We're going to talk," I said, cutting her off as I walked past her into the living room. "But first, I want to make something clear. I'm not here to fix anything. I'm not here to listen to you tell me how sorry you are or how it was a mistake. I don't care. This is about figuring out what happens next." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let it get to me. I'd seen enough of her crying over the past few weeks, and I wasn't about to let her tears change my mind. She had made her choices, and now it was time to face the consequences. She followed me into the living room and sat down on the couch, wringing her hands in her lap. I stayed standing, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed, keeping my distance. I didn't want to sit next to her. I didn't even want to be in the same room with her, but this conversation had to happen. "I know I messed up," she started, her voice shaky. "I know I hurt you, Tom, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I made a horrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since." "Stop," I said sharply, holding up a hand. "I told you, I don't want to hear it. This isn't about your regrets or your feelings. This is about the fact that you lied to me. You betrayed me. And now, we have to figure out how to deal with the fallout." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I understand. But please, Tom, can't we at least talk about trying to make this work? We've been together for so long. We've built a life together. We can fix this." I shook my head, feeling a surge of anger rise up again. "Fix this? There's no fixing this, Vanessa. You don't just come back from something like this. You slept with my boss, for God's sake. You lied to me for months. You didn't even try to stop. How am I supposed to trust you after that?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. It just got out of control. I was lonely, Tom. I felt like you didn't care about me anymore, and David was there. He listened to me when you didn't. So this is my fault?" I asked, my voice rising in anger. "You're blaming me for what you did. Because I was working to support our family, to give us the life we have? You're telling me that wasn't enough for you?" "No, that's not what I'm saying," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not blaming you, Tom. I don't know. I was stupid. I was selfish. And I hate myself for it. But I don't want to lose you. I love you." "Love?" I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. "You don't get to throw that word around like it still means something. Love doesn't look like this, Vanessa. Love isn't lying and sneaking around behind someone's back. Love isn't destroying everything we've built together for a cheap affair." She broke down then, her sobs racking her body as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice muffled by her hands. "I'm so sorry." I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the same woman I'd married. She wasn't the woman I'd built a life with. That woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't even recognize anymore. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "You'll get the papers soon. Harris is handling everything." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with panic. "No, please," she begged, shaking her head. "Don't do this, Tom. Don't throw everything away. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can." "There's no fixing this," I said firmly. "I'm done, Vanessa. We're done." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let her tears change anything. I had made up my mind, and there was no going back. What about the kids? She asked through her tears, her voice desperate. What are we going to tell them? We'll figure it out, I said, my tone cold. But I'm not going to lie to them. I'm not going to sugarcoat what happened. They deserve the truth. You can't tell them everything, she whispered, her voice breaking. They don't need to know about David. Please, Tom, don't do that to them. I'll tell them what they need to know, I said. And they'll know that you're the reason our family is falling apart. She buried her face in her hands again, her sobs echoing through the living room. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her cry, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no pity. Just a cold, hard finality. I'll come by to get the rest of my things tomorrow, I said, turning toward the door. And I'll make sure Harris contacts you about the divorce. Tom, please, she cried, her voice breaking. Don't leave. Don't do this. But I didn't respond. I walked out of the house, closing the door behind me, her sobs fading into the background as I stepped into the cool night air. It was over. Whatever we had, whatever we'd built, it was gone. And now, it was time to move on. As I drove away, I thought about what came next. The divorce would be messy, but I had the upper hand. I had the proof, the legal team, and the resolve to see it through. Vanessa would fight, no doubt, but there was no coming back from this. She had destroyed our life together, and now she was going to pay for it. I didn't feel victorious. There was no sense of triumph or satisfaction. Just a quiet, cold emptiness that settled in my chest. I'd lost something, too. Something I couldn't get back. But at least now, I could see things clearly. I wasn't stuck in the dark anymore. I knew the truth. And that was enough. Driving away from that house for what felt like the final time, I expected to feel some sense of closure, like turning the last page of a bad chapter. But there was no relief, no sudden weight lifted. All I had was this dull, persistent ache in my chest. I was free, sure, but what did that even mean? I'd spent years building a life with Vanessa, pouring myself into that relationship, into our family. And now it was over. It wasn't a clean break, it was a jagged, bloody mess. I pulled into the hotel parking lot where I'd been staying for the last few days. The place wasn't much, just a sterile room with beige walls and a bed that smelled faintly of bleach. But it was better than staying at home, facing the ghost of what my life used to be. I grabbed my phone and stared at the screen for a while, thinking about the next steps. Harris had assured me everything was moving forward on the legal front. Vanessa would get the divorce papers soon, and once that process started, there'd be no turning back. I didn't even want to imagine her reaction when she saw the terms I'd laid out. I wasn't going to leave her penniless, there were kids involved, after all, but she wasn't walking away with any of the extras she might have hoped for. Speaking of the kids, that was the one part that gnawed at me. We hadn't talked to them yet, hadn't told them the truth about what was going on. They were still living their lives, blissfully unaware of the disaster that was about to hit them. Vanessa had begged me not to tell them the whole truth, to spare them the details of her affair with David. She wanted to paint it as a mutual split, to soften the blow. But why should I protect her from the fallout of her own actions? Why should I lie to my kids when she hadn't even had the decency to be honest with me? That night, lying on that stiff hotel bed, I wrestled with the decision. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Telling the kids everything wasn't going to undo what had happened. It wasn't going to fix the marriage or heal the wounds. It was just going to hurt them, and I wasn't sure I could live with myself if I caused them any more pain than they were already about to go through. I didn't know Vanessa anything, but I owed my kids the chance to get through this without being dragged through the mud. The next morning, I made the call. Vanessa, we need to talk to the kids together. Tomorrow. She was silent on the other end for a moment, probably trying to gauge my tone, trying to figure out what I had in mind. Okay, she said quietly. I think that's the right thing to do. We need to tell them gently. I hung up without saying anything else. I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to shield her, but I also wasn't going to turn this into a spectacle. The kids didn't need to know the sordid details right now. It would come out eventually, because these things always do, but for now, I'd let them have the version where their parents were simply splitting up because they couldn't make it work. The next day, I drove back to the house. Vanessa was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn, like she hadn't slept much since our last conversation. I didn't care. She could lose a few nights of sleep. She deserved that and more. But today wasn't about her. It was about the kids. We sat down with them in the living room, me on one end of the couch, Vanessa on the other. The distance between us spoke louder than words. The kids sat across from us, looking confused and worried, like they knew something was wrong but couldn't quite figure out what. They were old enough to sense it. Our daughter was 16, our son 14. They'd noticed the tension, the coldness between us. But still, nothing could have prepared them for what we were about to tell them. "Your mom and I need to talk to you about something important," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I wasn't great at this kind of thing. Never had been. Vanessa used to be the one who handled the emotional stuff, the hard conversations. Now, here we were, and I had to do it without her. "We've decided that we're going to get a divorce." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite gone off yet. My daughter's face crumpled first, her eyes welling up with tears almost immediately. My son just stared at us, his expression blank, like he couldn't process what we were saying. "What?" "Why?" my daughter asked, her voice cracking. "You can't just. I mean, why now? What happened?" Vanessa jumped in then, her voice soft and pleading. "We've been having some problems for a while, sweetheart. We've tried to work through them, but we just can't seem to fix it." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to snap at her. It wasn't about fixing it. It was about the fact that she had broken it beyond repair. But I kept my mouth shut, for the kids' sake. "But why?" my son asked, his voice quieter, more controlled than his sister's. "You guys never even fought. You seemed fine." "We weren't fine," I said, finally speaking up. "We just didn't show it in front of you. But there have been problems for a long time, and we think it's better for everyone if we go our separate ways." It felt like a lie, even as I said it. But what was the alternative? Telling them their mom had been cheating on me with my boss? Telling them that the life they thought we had was a complete sham? I couldn't do that to them. Not yet. My daughter broke down then, sobbing into her hands, while my son just sat there, staring at the floor. Vanessa reached out to comfort them, but I stayed where I was. I didn't have it in me to play the part of the sympathetic father right now. All I could think about was how everything had fallen apart, how all the years we'd spent building this family were gone in an instant. We sat there for a while longer, trying to reassure them that everything would be okay, that we still loved them, that we'd still be a family even if we weren't living together. But the truth was, none of us knew what the future was going to look like. Not anymore. After we finished talking to the kids, I left the house again. I couldn't stay there, not with the weight of everything pressing down on me. I drove around aimlessly for a while, not really knowing where I was going. Just trying to clear my head, trying to make sense of everything. That night, I went back to the hotel and sat in the dark, thinking about the next steps. The divorce was happening, that much was certain. The lawyers were handling the paperwork, and soon Vanessa and I would officially be done. But what about after that? What came next? I didn't have an answer. I wasn't the type of guy to sit around and wallow in self-pity, but I couldn't just pretend like everything was fine either. I knew I'd get through it. People did it all the time. They went through divorces, picked up the pieces, and moved on. I'd be fine eventually. But that didn't make the present any easier. In the days that followed, the reality of the situation started to sink in. The paperwork moved quickly, and before long, the official terms were laid out. Vanessa would keep the house, but I wasn't about to fight for it. I didn't want it anymore. Every room in that place was tainted by what had happened, by the lies and the betrayal. Let her have it. I'd start fresh somewhere else. Harris had done a good job of making sure I walked away with what I needed. I wasn't going to be left out in the cold, and Vanessa wasn't getting away with everything either. It was a clean break, as clean as these things could be. The kids would split time between us, and as much as I hated the idea of not seeing them every day, I knew it was the best solution for them. One afternoon, as I packed up the last of my things from the hotel to move into a rental, I got a call from Harris. "It's done," he said simply. "The divorce is finalized. You're officially free." Free. The word didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was no sense of victory or relief. Just a quiet acceptance that this chapter of my life was over. It wasn't what I'd planned, but it was reality. And now, I had to figure out what came next. I drove to the new place, a modest rental on the other side of town, and started unpacking my things. It was a fresh start, sure, but it still felt empty. Like I was going through the motions, waiting for something to fill the void. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't about filling the void right away. Maybe it was just about learning how to live with it, how to move forward, one step at a time. As I sat on the couch that first night, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the unfamiliar silence of a new place, I realized something. I wasn't the same man I had been when this all started. The old version of me, the one who trusted blindly, who believed in the life he'd built, was gone. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I had learned something from all of this. I'd learned that nothing in life was guaranteed, that trust could be shattered in an instant, and that sometimes, the people you love most will hurt you in ways you never thought possible. But I'd also learned that I could survive it. I could pick up the pieces, even if they didn't fit together the way they used to. I could move forward, even if I didn't know exactly where I was headed. In the end, that was enough. For now, it was enough.